Okay, ahoy, guys, it's Mrs. Klein.
Welcome back. It's Mrs. Wolbrin. We're going to continue with our podcast. Reminder of your guiding question. How was the Continental Army able to win the war for independence from Great Britain?
Yeah, last time we were talking about some of our strengths and weaknesses and some of Great Britain's strengths and weaknesses. So Here we go. We were in dire straits.
Yes, the tide begins to turn at this point. When the American Revolution began, both sides adopted the same military strategy. Strategy is an overall plan for winning the war. The strategy was to defeat the enemy in one big battle. After barely escaping from his loss in New York, Washington revised his strategy. In the future, he wrote Congress, he would avoid large battles that might put his army at risk. Instead, the war would be defensive, meaning that rather than defeating the British, Washington hoped to tire them out.
Yeah, I remember him having really great success with knowing when it was time to cut and run and get away and then come back on another day.
And he had a nickname, the Master of Retreat.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. The British also come up with a new strategy. Germain revised the British strategy as well by plotting to divide the rebels by taking control of New York's Hudson River Valley. To carry out this plan, General John Burgoyne left Canada in June 1777 with about 8,000 British soldiers and American Indian warriors. He planned to move this army south to Albany, New York. There he would meet up with General Howe, who was supposed to march his army north from New York City.
Okay. Now, there were some problems with Burgoyne's plan. There were two big problems with Burgoyne's plan in particular. The first was that what looked like an easy invasion route on a map was anything but easy. Yeah, you got to look at those.
Yeah, exactly. Those little
marks, those little lines.
Those little lines, yep.
Yeah, not that they had it at that time. The second problem with Burgoyne's plan was that General Howe had his own ideas about how to win the war. Instead of marching to Albany, Howe headed for the rebels' capital at Philadelphia, where he hoped to lure Washington into another major battle. Howe also hoped it would be the last one.
All right. This is a turning point, you guys, for us. By the time the slow-moving Burgoyne finally reached Saratoga Springs on the Hudson River, the area was swarming with militia. On October 17th, 1777, Burgoyne accepted defeat. Burgoyne's surrender marked a turning point in the war for the Americans.
And not long after this victory, France came into the war as an ally of the United States by sending money, weapons, troops, and warships to the Americans. With Spain also entering the war against Great Britain, the American cause no longer looked quite so hopeless.
Yeah, as soon as those people realized that there was a chance that we were going to win, they decided to get on board and get on our side. Mm-hmm. All right, but then Washington and his men have to suffer a winter at Valley Forge. Okay, the battles of Saratoga were a stunning victory, but the war was far from over. While General Washington's army roamed the countryside, Howe's forces still occupied Philadelphia. Late in 1777, Congress declared a day of Thanksgiving for the Army's successes. By this time, Washington and his army were on their way to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, to make camp for the winter. Joseph Martin, our friend from earlier, described the Army's celebration.
Yes. We had nothing to eat for 2 or 3 days previous, but we must now have what Congress said, a sumptuous or lavish Thanksgiving. It gave each and every man a gill, a few ounces of rice, and a tablespoon of vinegar. The army was now not only starved, but naked. The greatest part were not only shirtless and barefoot, but destitute or without any other clothing, especially blankets.
And this is the middle of winter, you guys. Yeah. It's not back in Pennsylvania. All right. To help lift his men from their misery, Washington put Baron Frederick von Steuben in charge of training. A military officer from Prussia in modern-day Germany, von Steuben arrived in December of 1777 and set to work turning the Continental Army into an organized fighting force.
Another foreign volunteer, the Marquis de Lafayette, also helped raise the troops' spirits. Although he was one of the richest men in France, Lafayette chose to share the hardships of Valley Forge, even using his own money to buy the men warm clothing. The patient fortitude or courage of the officers and soldiers, Lafayette wrote, was a continual miracle.
When at last spring arrived, Washington received news that the British were about to abandon Philadelphia. The time had come to put his newly trained army to the test.
Mm-hmm. Now it was Washington's turn to chase an army across New Jersey. And he caught up with the retreating British near Monmouth, Monmouth?
Monmouth. Yep.
Okay, thank you. On June 28th, 1778, in the battle that followed, Washington seemed to be everywhere, constantly rallying his men to stand and fight, cheering them by his voice and example, wrote Lafayette. Never had I beheld so superb a man.
Now the war moves to the south, you guys. After failing to conquer any state in the north, the British changed strategies yet again. Their new plan was to move the war to the south, where they believed thousands of loyalists were just waiting to join the king's cause.
Mm-hmm. Late in 1780, Washington sent General Nathanael Greene to slow the British advance through the south, but his army was too small to meet Cornwallis in a major battle. Instead, Greene led Cornwallis's troops on an exhausting chase through the southern backcountry. He wrote of his strategy: "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again."
Greene's strategy worked wonderfully, and in April of 1781, Cornwallis wrote that he was quite tired of marching about the country. He moved his army to Yorktown, a sleepy tobacco port on the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, for a good rest.
Okay. However, this turns into a trap.
Yes.
By the time Cornwallis was settling into Yorktown, France had sent nearly 5,000 troops to join Washington's army in New York. In August, Washington learned that another 3,000 troops were scheduled to arrive soon in 29 French warships.
Thank good for the French. Thank goodness for them. All right, Washington used this information to set a trap for Cornwallis. Secretly, he moved his army south to Virginia, where they joined the French in surrounding Yorktown on land with more than 16,000 troops. You guys, Yorktown is like on a peninsula, so it made it pretty easy for them to be surrounded.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the French warships showed up just in time to seal off the entrance to Chesapeake Bay.
And Joseph Martin watched as a flag was raised to signal that American and French gunners should open fire on Yorktown. "I confess," he says, "that I felt a secret pride swell in my heart when I saw the Star-Spangled Banner waving majestically. The shelling went on for days until most of the guns in the enemy's works were silenced."
All right, so Cornwallis surrenders. At first, Cornwallis clung to the hope that the British Navy would come to his rescue, even as Yorktown was exploding around him. When no ships arrived, he finally agreed to surrender. Behind the lines, this is after his surrender, behind the lines of soldiers stood civilians who had traveled for miles to witness Cornwallis's surrender.
So you got all these witnesses, but Cornwallis did not take part in this ceremony, saying that he was ill. But in reality, the British commander could not bear to surrender publicly to an army that he looked down on as a contemptible and undisciplined rabble or mob. All right, you guys, so the war ends, and for most Americans, the end of the war was a time for joy and celebration. They had gained the freedom to govern themselves and create their own future. But liberty came at a high price. At least 6,200 Americans had been killed in combat, with an additional 10,000 who died in camp because of diseases, and another 8,500 who died while in captivity as British prisoners. As a proportion of the total population, more Americans died fighting in the American Revolution than in any other conflict except the Civil War, in which Americans fought one another. So we end up, war comes to a close and we have to sign a treaty, which is called the Treaty of Paris. And during the war, loyalists had been treated badly by patriots, so many did not trust the treaty's promise of fair treatment. It's one of the things we said we were going to do, but people didn't trust it. And as a result of that, more than 80,000 loyalists, both black and white, left the United States to settle in British Canada. Okay, all right. The impact of the American Revolution was felt in many places. The American example was especially influential in France, which soon had its own revolution. And we find out a little bit more about that and kind of how we help or don't help when we get into another unit.
All right.
We're going to end this podcast right now, you guys. It's quitting time.
And we'll talk to you soon.